Hi, it's Leslie Meredith with Breakbulk Events and Media. I'm here in the studio in Houston with Dennis Mottola, who has recently finished a session with his colleague Frank Reynolds about Incoterms. The new edition has just come out, and they were here to talk about important changes, what people need to know, and how those will be applied moving forward. Welcome, Dennis.
Thank you, Leslie. Pleasure to be here with you.
Great. Well, good to have you. So let's start with what are Incoterms and why are they important to the people in this hall?
Okay, so they're important because they're needed for trade, right? So Incoterms are known as trade and delivery terms, and they're used in sales contracts. So sales contract being a freight forwarder. So they're a kind of a shorthanded version of an agreement on point of delivery, risk of loss, obligations on buyer and seller, and then cost. So it's a convenient way of referencing a set of rules that are agreed and used universally that eliminate the need for countries or differing laws between differing countries. So they're kind of a standardized set of rules. So regardless of where a buyer might be located and where the seller is located, or regardless of where the goods are being moved from, which may be neither of those two countries, when you reference Incoterms, you are applying a standard set of rules with regard to those three things: delivery, risk of loss, cost, supplier or buyer and seller obligations.
Excellent. All right. So we've just had a revised 2020 rules have come out. How do they differ from the previous set?
I'm not the expert on that because they just did come out, but of what I know, and I'm going to get trained officially tomorrow by Frank Reynolds, our expert that we had here today. But I think the objectives, from my understanding of the ICC with these revisions, the 2020 revisions, were to make clarifications, to make it easier for sellers and buyers to know how to use the terms appropriately. So there are 11 Incoterms today in the 2010 revisions, which we're still using. There will still be 11 with the 2020, and there's really been only one three-letter Incoterm rule that changed out from the 2010 to the 2020 revisions. So there's not been a significant amount of changes like there were in 2010. But I think they worked very hard on clarification and getting more precision with regard to what the Incoterms or how the Incoterms should be used.
Okay. So in your opinion, do the majority of shippers and anyone who's involved in applying these terms and contracts, do they have an adequate understanding of them?
I would say an inadequate understanding of it. It just seems like it's a never-ending challenge to educate all the various disciplines that need to know about Incoterms, but particularly with regard to buyers, the actual folks that are issuing purchase orders or issuing sales contracts. Obviously, there's turnover in people resources continually, so those folks need to be taught how to apply Incoterms. They need to be taught and understand how Incoterms tie with the buying of transportation and various logistics services. So placing an order cannot be done in a vacuum where you're not considering then what logistics plan is for movement of the goods and how they intend to buy transportation. So that syncing up has to happen early on before, even before the buyer sends an RFQ out to his or her suppliers, and asks for pricing based on perhaps various delivery terms or various delivery arrangements. And so it's a challenge to keep people educated on it. And the rules do change every 10 years. And so there's re-education that needs to be done. But I think just comments that I've received, particularly now since I've, retired from Bechtel, I'm doing consulting work. I see that more and more from people, that people need that training, and that it's key, regardless of whether you're in purchasing, you're in logistics, if you're in sales, finance, contracts, legal, whatever it is. All of those people are in some way engaged in that transaction, and they all need to have an understanding of Incoterms. So
okay. Now, I understand that Frank Reynolds is running some workshops for this. Can you tell us about that?
I can tell you that he has a very aggressive and very ambitious schedule for those workshops. He started last month, I think maybe one in Chicago, and has been going all over the U.S. And in fact is having one tomorrow in Houston, and we'll be coming back to Houston in December for another workshop. So it's a whole day seminar, and Frank teaches it. And as part of that, recipients receive a copy of the new Incoterms book, and also his book that he's authored now, the third version of that, called Incoterms for Americans. And so Frank, with that book, does a very good job of applying Incoterms for U.S. domestic transactions and explaining how to use Incoterms for transactions. So there's many companies that still are using UCC delivery terms, which are really outdated, but use UCC for delivery terms rather than Incoterms. And Incoterms in 2010 were specifically adapted to be more applicable for domestic trade transactions. So because there's still a buyer, there's still a seller, there's still a point of delivery, there's still risk of loss, there's still costs and obligations for domestic transactions, just as there are for international. So the U.S. has been slow, I think, on the whole, to adapt the use of Incoterms for domestic sales transactions. So Frank has tried to help, nudge that along by this publication that he authors specifically for that purpose.
Excellent. Well, that is a good resource for those involved in buying and selling in our industry. And thank you so much for sharing all that information with us.
Always my pleasure. Thank you.